All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or situations is purely coincidental. Please don't judge too harshly. Every author was once a beginner. We strongly condemn cheating, alcohol consumption, illegal substances, and any violation of the law. Write in the comments what city you are from and where you listen to this audio version. Don't forget to like, share your life experiences, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting story. May 2018, Nebraska. John Carter, a 40-year-old truck driver, was driving his truck down I-80. The sun was high, illuminating the cornfields, but John wasn't looking. His thoughts were on Emily, his ex-wife. He thought about 1999, when they first met, about her smile, the way she laughed at their wedding. These memories came naturally, despite the 5 years that had passed since their divorce. John stopped at Mike Reed's, where he heard from another driver. Emily had fallen in with a bad crowd in Los Angeles. The news brought back old pain, forcing John to think about the past and what he might have missed. John parked his Peterbilt at the gas station where Mike's diner was. It was an old diner with red couches and a counter where Mike, a Vietnam veteran, was always manned. John got out of his cab, stretched, and headed toward the entrance. It smelled of coffee and bacon. He sat down in his usual chair by the window. "Hey, John," Mike looked up from the counter. "How's the ride?" "Fine," John shrugged, taking off his cap. "Give me some coffee, like usual." Mike nodded and poured him a large mug. "You seem thoughtful today. Are you thinking about her again?" Mike asked, placing the mug in front of John. John frowned. Mike always knew when he was in a bad mood and wasn't shy about getting into his soul. "Don't start, Mike," John said, sipping his coffee. "I'm just tired." "Tired, you say?" Mike chuckled, wiping down the counter. "And I thought you were thinking about Emily again. I heard she's in L.A., not in the best of circumstances, they say." John froze. He didn't want to hear about Emily, but Mike's words hurt him. "Who is speaking?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Bobby, the one who hauls furniture to Oregon," Mike said. "He was here yesterday. Said he saw her in some part of Los Angeles, with people you don't want to mess with." John squeezed his mug. He hadn't seen Emily since 2013, when she'd filed for divorce. She'd admitted to cheating on him, first in Iraq, then at home. It had shattered him. But now, hearing that she was in trouble, he felt a mixture of anger and worry. "I don't care," he said, looking out the window. "She made her choice." "Yeah," Mike shrugged. "But you still think about her. I can see it." John didn't answer. He looked at the highway where cars were passing. Mike was right, but John didn't want to admit it. Instead, he thought back to 1999. He was 21, fresh out of the Army, a Desert Storm veteran. Emily was a waitress at a diner in Omaha. She smiled at him when he ordered a burger, and he was gone. They started dating, and a year later he proposed. The wedding was small, at a local church, but John had never been happier. "Will you have a burger?" Mike interrupted his thoughts. "Yes, go ahead," John nodded. Mike shouted the order to the cook and returned to John. "Look, I'm not interfering in your affairs, but maybe you should find out what's wrong with her," he said. "For Lily's sake, at least." Lily. John felt a warmth in his chest at the thought of his daughter. She was 11, and she was the meaning of his life. But she started asking questions about her mother, and John didn't know how to answer. He didn't want to say that Emily had betrayed him. "Lily can't know," John said. "It's hard enough for her." "You don't think she'll figure it out?" Mike shook his head. "Kids are smarter than they look. She's already asking, right?" John nodded. Lily had called yesterday, asking why her mother hadn't come. He'd lied that Emily was busy with work, but he felt she didn't believe him. "I'll figure it out," he muttered. Mike placed a plate of burger and fries in front of him. "Figure it out, John, but don't sit in the past. It will eat you up." John started to eat, but he had no appetite. He thought about what Bobby had said. Emily in Los Angeles, with bad company. What did that mean? He didn't want to dig, but the thought that she was in danger was nagging at him. He thought back to 2005, when she was in Iraq. They talked on the phone every day. She talked about the tallow base, the heat, the dust. He heard the weariness in her voice, but he figured that was normal. He'd been in the army himself. He knew how exhausting war was. But then the calls became less frequent, her voice colder. He hadn't noticed how distant she was. "Hey, John," Bobby, the trucker, walked into the cafe. He was tall, with a beard and a permanent chewing gum in his mouth. "How are you, old man?" "Fine," John answered without looking at him. Bobby sat down next to him, ordered coffee, and turned to John. "Heard Mike tell you? About your ex," he said, lowering his voice. "I saw her a couple months ago, in LA, in an area where normal people don't hang out." "So what?" John tried not to show interest. "Nothing good," Bobby shrugged. "She was with some dudes, not the type you want to be friends with. She didn't look so good, to be honest." John clenched his jaw. He didn't want to imagine Emily like this. She was a major in the army, strong, smart. How had she gotten to this point? "Maybe you're wrong," he said. "Maybe," Bobby sipped his coffee. "But I remember her well. She came here with you about 10 years ago." John nodded. Emily had actually come into Mike's cafe when they were married. She'd sat on this same chair, laughed, and eaten his fries. Everything had been fine then, or so he thought. "Okay, I gotta go," Bobby said, standing up. "See you later, John." "Uh-huh," John muttered. When Bobby left, Mike returned to the counter. "Well, are you going to do something?" he asked. "I don't know," John answered honestly. "I don't want to interfere in her life. But if she's in trouble—" "What then?" Mike narrowed his eyes. "Are you going to save her?" John shook his head. "I don't know, Mike. I just can't let her go." Mike sighed. "I understand. But think about Lily, and about yourself. You've been living like a monk for 5 years. Maybe it's time to start over." John didn't answer. He finished his coffee, left the money on the counter, and walked out into the parking lot. The sun was setting, and the sky had turned pink. He pulled out his phone and looked at a photo of Lily, smiling and holding an ice cream. John smiled back. For her sake, he had to figure this out. But how? He climbed into the cab and started the engine. The road ahead was long, and he knew that thoughts of Emily would travel with him. He remembered their wedding in 2000. Emily in a white dress, her hair smelling of chamomile. They danced Toddavid Clark, adjusted his cap, rubbed his tired eyes, and turned up the volume on his old tape recorder. Johnny Cash's voice was blaring from the speakers, Ring of Fire, which he was probably listening to for the 1000th time. I-10 stretched ahead, a black ribbon of asphalt beneath the headlights of his old Peterbilt. It was midnight, and Texas was asleep, except for the occasional gas station with its blinking neon signs. David loved the night drives, the silence, the emptiness, just him and the road. But tonight, something was wrong. The song was catching on something, reminding him of Linda. He glanced at the passenger seat, where there was a pack of cigarettes and a worn leather wallet. Inside the wallet, between the 20s and the receipts, was their wedding photo, folded in half. Linda in a white dress, he in an unfamiliar suit, both laughing as if the world belonged to them. 15 years ago. David chuckled, shook his head, and turned back to the road. The truck hummed, the tires slapped against the asphalt. David reached for the bottle of water in the cup holder and took a sip. He'd been on the road for 10 hours, hauling cargo from El Paso to Houston. He had another 6 hours to go if he didn't run into a traffic jam or a way station check. Trucking had been his salvation after the Army. No bosses, just you, the truck, and the schedule. But on nights like this, the thoughts crept into his head, and there was no escape. He clicked the button on the tape recorder, rewound the tape. Johnny Cash began singing about fire and love again. David remembered the first time Linda heard that song in his old pickup truck, before they were married. They had gone to the lake, had a picnic, drank beer, and danced right on the grass. She laughed when he tried to spin her around, and then she fell on top of him, and they both collapsed on the blanket, laughing until they cried. "You're a terrible dancer, Clark," she said then, poking him in the shoulder. "You're being too picky, Lieutenant," he replied, imitating her military tone. "Lieutenant? Ha, I'll show you a lieutenant." Linda grabbed a bottle of beer and splashed it on him, and he caught her by the waist and kissed her. David smiled at the memory, but it quickly faded. He hadn't seen Linda in 3 years. The divorce had been in 2019, and he had lived alone since then, save for the occasional call from old Army friends. He didn't know where she was, what she was doing. He didn't want to know. But memories of her, of those good days, still came back to him like that damn song. The headlights caught a road sign, "Rest Stop 5 miles." David decided it was time to take a break. He turned on his turn signal, smoothly moved into the right lane, and a couple of minutes later, he was already parking in the parking lot. The stop was almost empty. A couple of trucks, a minivan with a sticker baby on board, and a 24-hour snack bar with a flashing sign in her open 24/7. David turned off the engine, stretched, cracking his back, and climbed out of the cabin. The night air was cool and smelled of dust and gasoline. He pulled on his jacket, shoved his hands in his pockets, and headed toward the diner. It was warm inside and smelled of coffee and fried bacon. Behind the counter stood a waitress in her 30s, her face tired and her lipstick bright red. She looked up from her phone and nodded at him. "Good night," she said. "Coffee?" "Yeah, black, and maybe a couple of donuts, if they're fresh." "As fresh as my smile," she joked, showing her teeth. "Sit down, I'll bring them right away." David settled into a tall, worn leather stool behind the counter. He glanced around the room. A couple of truckers in the corner staring at their plates, a guy in a hoodie dozing over his laptop. The waitress set a mug of coffee and a plate with 2 glazed donuts in front of him. "How far are you going?" she asked, wiping down the counter. "Houston," David replied, taking a sip of coffee. It was hot and strong, just the way he liked it. "Long way. You look like you haven't slept for a couple of days." "I'm used to it," he shrugged. "And you've been here all night?" "Until 6 in the morning, then home to the children." She smiled, but her eyes remained tired. "Are you married?" David hesitated. The question was simple, but every time it was asked, he felt a pang in his chest. He rubbed his wedding ring, which he still had on for 3 years. "I was," he said briefly, "a long time ago." "I understand," the waitress nodded without insisting. "If anything, call me, I'm here." She walked to the cash register, and David stared into his mug. He didn't want to talk about Linda, but his thoughts kept coming back to her. Back to the spring of 2004, when they got married. He was 30, she was 25. He had just returned from the Army, she was finishing officer training. Their wedding was small, a small hall at a local church, about 50 guests, mostly friends and co-workers. Linda had insisted on keeping it simple. He remembered how they were preparing for the wedding. Linda sat on the sofa in their rented apartment, surrounded by dress catalogs, grumbling that everything was too expensive. "Listen, David," she said, throwing the magazine aside. "Let's just run away to Vegas. Seriously, why do we need this circus?" "Because your mother will kill me if there's no wedding," he replied, sitting on the floor with a can of beer. "And I want to see you in a dress." "Oh, romantic." Linda rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Okay, but no stupid bow ties or tuxedos. You're in a suit, I'll be in a dress, period." "Agreed, but the cake will have chocolate icing. Only if I choose flowers." They laughed then, argued about little things, but it was all so easy, so natural. David loved her voice, her laugh, the way she could be tough as an army sergeant and soft as a girl at the same time. She was his opposite, he was silent, stubborn, and she was bright, always on the move. But together they worked like a well-tuned engine. The wedding went perfectly, despite all the fears. Linda looked stunning in a simple white dress, with her hair down and a bouquet of daisies. David still remembered her walking down the aisle toward him, and him standing there, feeling like his heart was about to jump out of his chest. After the ceremony, they danced to that Johnny Cash song, and she whispered in his ear, "You're still a terrible dancer, Clark." "And you're still picking on me, Mrs. Clark," he replied, and they both burst out laughing. David took a bite of the donut, but it tasted bland. He pushed the plate away and finished his coffee. The memory was so vivid he could almost smell her perfume vanilla and something floral. He closed his eyes, trying to push the images away. Why was he even thinking about it? It had been 3 years. She was gone. The marriage was over. But every time he got in the truck and played that tape, she came back. He pulled out his wallet, opened it, and pulled out a photograph. It was tattered, the corners dog-eared, but the faces were still clear. Linda was laughing, her eyes shining, and he looked at her as if she were a miracle. David ran his finger over the picture, then folded it carefully and put it back. More coffee? The waitress appeared next to her, holding a coffee pot. "No, thanks," he shook his head. "Time to go." "Well, good luck on the road. Take care of yourself." "Yeah, you too." He left a tenner on the counter, including the tip, and headed for the exit. The parking lot was quiet, except for the hum of a generator in the distance. David climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. Johnny Cash began singing again, and David didn't turn it off. He looked at the road, at the endless white stripes, and thought about how everything had changed. Once he had Linda, a house, a life in which he was happy. Now there was only the road, the truck, and this tape, which still sounded like an echo of those days. He adjusted his rearview mirror and picked up speed. Houston waited, and with it another day, another flight. The sun was hot, and the smell of coals and sizzling steaks filled the backyard of David and Linda Clark's house. It was a Saturday in May 2004, a perfect day for a barbecue. Their small house outside Austin, with its neatly trimmed lawn and Texas flag on the porch, looked like a postcard from the American dream. David stood at the grill, wearing an old Army t-shirt and a baseball cap, turning meat with tongs. Linda sat at the wooden table on the porch, slicing tomatoes for a salad and humming on the radio next to her. "Hey, Clark, don't burn the steaks," she called, not looking up from the board. "I don't eat coal." "Easy, Lieutenant," David replied, grinning. "I'm a grill master, remember?" "Master, of course. Last time we ate potatoes because your masterpiece is burned." Linda laughed, and David shook his head, Mock rolling his eyes. He liked the way she teased him. It was their game she teased, he snapped, but it was all done with a warmth that words couldn't explain. He glanced at her. Linda, in shorts and a white tank top, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, looked just like the day they met. Only now she was his wife, and that still seemed like a miracle. David put down the tongs and walked over to the table, wiping his hands on his apron. He leaned over and kissed Linda on the top of her head. "What?" She looked up, smiling. "Is this a bribe so I don't have to check the meat?" "Just like that," he said, sitting down opposite. "Can't you kiss your wife?" "You can, but it's suspicious." Linda poked him with a vegetable knife, playfully threatening him. "If the steaks burn, you won't get away with kisses." David laughed and reached for a can of beer from the cooler. He opened it, took a sip, and handed it to Linda. She shook her head. "I'm driving, remember? I'll drive you home tonight if you get drunk." "Me? Get drunk." David pressed his hand to his chest, feigning insult. "I'm a model citizen." "Yeah, exemplary, until you start singing karaoke after 3 cans." Linda snorted, returning to the tomatoes. A Tracy Chapman song came on the radio, and Linda began to sing along, bobbing her head. David watched her and felt a warmth spread inside him. They had been married for almost a year, but he still hadn't gotten used to how easily she filled his life. Linda was an Air Force officer, smart, confident, with a temper that could put anyone in their place. But at home, she was just Linda, his Linda, who liked pizza with anchovies and argued with him about the best barbecue sauce. "Listen," he said, putting down his beer. "What if we call the guys next week? Sam and his wife, maybe a couple more from the base?" "Barbecue number 2? Linda raised an eyebrow. "You just want to show off your grill." "Guilty." David raised his hands. "But seriously, we haven't gotten together for a long time." She thought, tapping the knife on the board. Okay, but I choose the music. None of your country all night. That's a low blow, he said, but he smiled. Deal. Just don't turn on your pop. Linda stuck her tongue out at him and went back to her salad. David stood up to check on the grill. The steak sizzled, juices dripping onto the coals, and he nodded, satisfied. Everything was going according to plan. He loved days like these, easy, unhurried, when he could just be with Linda, talking about small things and making plans. They often talked about the future, children, how they would buy a bigger house, maybe even a farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Linda wanted a dog. David wanted a car repair shop. These were dreams that seemed so close, so real. Hey, Linda called as he returned to the table with a plate of hot steaks. Have you thought about where to go on vacation? I could take a couple of weeks in August. Really? David sat down, setting down his plate. I was thinking about Colorado. Mountains, fishing, no phones. Fishing. She grimaced. You know I don't sit for hours with a fishing rod. Okay, he raised his hands. Then hiking, or just lying around in a house by the lake. That's better, Linda smiled. But I'm taking books with me. And wine. And I'll have beer and a guitar, said David. We'll sing around the campfire. Just not my army songs, she rolled her eyes. I heard enough of them before the wedding. They laughed, and Linda pulled out a bowl of salad. David laid out the steaks, and they began to eat, still chatting. The food was simple meat, foil-wrapped potatoes, salad, but for them it was a feast. Linda told stories about her last training session at the base, about how one of the recruits dropped a box of equipment and got a dressing down. David shared stories from his flights about being stuck at a gas station with a breakdown and meeting a biker who claimed to have ridden all over America. Listen, Linda said, cutting off a piece of steak. Don't you want to go back to the army? Well, at least to the reserves. No, David shook his head. I've had enough. I've served my time in the Persian Gulf. Now my war is on I-10 traffic. I'm just asking, she shrugged. You sometimes talk about those days like you miss them. I don't miss you, he said firmly. I'm happy here, with you. Linda looked at him, her eyes softening. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Okay, she said quietly, I just want you to be happy. I'm pleased, he replied, squeezing her hand back. Better than ever. They sat like that for a few seconds until Linda let go of his hand and went back to her food. David looked at her and thought how lucky he was. He wasn't one to talk about his feelings much, but Linda knew he loved her. She saw it in the way he fixed her car, the way he got up early to make her coffee, the way he always held her hand when they went for walks. After dinner, they cleared away the dishes, and Linda suggested a game of cards. They sat on the porch, with more beer for David and lemonade for Linda. The game was silly, some mix of poker and their own dating rules. Linda won 3 times in a row and threw her hands up in triumph. Admit it, Clark, I'm the queen of cards, she declared. Only because you cheat, he said, collecting the deck. Cheating? She gasped, pressing her hand to her chest. It's talent, darling. A talent for cheating, David grinned, and Linda threw a napkin at him. The sun began to set, turning the sky orange. They decided to make a fire in the yard. David brought some wood, and Linda brought a blanket and a couple of pillows. They sat by the fire, looking at the flames, and the conversation became quieter, calmer. Linda snuggled into David's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, inhaling the scent of her hair chamomile shampoo, her favorite. You know, she said, looking at the fire, sometimes I think how lucky we are, that we found each other. Yeah, he replied, stroking her hand. I think about it every day. Seriously, she turned to look at him. You're not very talkative about things like that. I'm not a talkative person, but I think, he said, you're the best thing I've got, Linda. She smiled and kissed him softly, but with a warmth that he felt all over his body. They sat like that for a long time, until the night became completely dark, and only the stars shone above their small house. On Sunday morning, everything changed. David woke up to the sound of his phone. Linda was already up, standing in the living room in her gym clothes, with her mobile phone to her ear. Her face was serious, her lips pressed together. David, still sleepy, walked into the room holding a mug of coffee. "What happened?" he asked, putting the mug on the table. "Wait," Linda raised her finger, listening to her interlocutor. "Yes, sir. Understood. I'll be ready." She hung up and turned to him. Her eyes were tense, but she tried to smile. "It's from the base," she said. "I'm being sent to Iraq in 3 weeks." "Iraq?" David frowned, feeling his stomach clench. "For how long?" "A year, maybe more," she answered, sitting down on the couch. "Talal Air Base. Logistics, nothing dangerous." David sat down next to her, trying to process it. He knew she could be sent overseas, she was an officer, part of the job. But it still hit her like a cold shower. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at her. "Yes," Linda nodded, but her voice was quieter than usual. "Just unexpected." "We'll manage," he said, taking her hand. "We'll call, we'll write. I'll wait." "I know," she squeezed his hand, "but it still sucks." They sat in silence, and David felt something change. Not in their love, it was just as strong, but in the air, in their little world. He put his arm around Linda, and she pressed herself against him, as if she wanted to remember this moment. "Everything will be fine," he said, although he himself was not sure. "Of course," she answered, but there was a shadow of doubt in her voice. They spent the rest of the day trying not to think about the future. Linda cooked sandwiches, David mended a rickety chair on the porch. They laughed and joked, but the news hung over them like a cloud. When they went to bed, Linda hugged him tightly, and David held her until she fell asleep. He looked at the ceiling, listening to her breathe, and thought about how much he loved her. Iraq was far away, but their love, he was sure, would endure anything. David Clark sat in the cab of his truck in a parking lot somewhere in Arizona, clutching an old Nokia cell phone. It was night in early February 2005, and the stars over the desert were so bright you could almost touch them. He had just finished unloading cargo in Phoenix and was waiting for the dispatcher to confirm the next flight. But his mind was not on work. He was looking at the screen of his phone, where the time appeared. 11:47 p.m., it was morning at Talal Air Force Base in Iraq, and Linda had promised to call. The truck hummed softly, the heater on low to keep the cabin warm. David leaned back in his seat, rubbed his neck, and took a sip from the can of Coke in the cup holder. His baseball cap lay on the dashboard, next to the pack of cigarettes he'd promised himself he'd quit, but never got around to. His phone was warm from holding it in his hand. He'd been waiting for a call for half an hour. Linda had warned him that the connection at the base was spotty, but every missed call still made him nervous. Finally, the phone vibrated and the screen lit up. David quickly pressed the answer button. "Linda," he said, pressing the phone to his ear. "Who else?" Her voice sounded tired, but with the usual mockery. "Did you think it was your dispatcher with a love letter?" "Ha, funny," David smiled, feeling the tension release. "I've been sitting here for an hour waiting for your call. Is everything okay?" "Fine," she replied. "Just busy. We've got, well, you know, an army here. Everything on schedule, everything on command." David heard noises in the background, voices, footsteps, a mechanical hum. He imagined Linda in her uniform, her hair cut short, standing somewhere in a dusty office on the base. She had been in Iraq for 3 weeks, and this was their first real conversation after short texts and a couple of broken calls. "How's the weather?" he asked, just to keep the conversation going. "It's hot," Linda said. "Dusty, sand everywhere, even in your teeth. What about you?" "It's cold," he said, looking out the window at the dark parking lot. "Arizona is like a refrigerator at night." Swap," she chuckled, but the laugh was weak. David frowned, catching something in her tone. She was always perky, even when tired, but today she sounded different, like she was carrying an extra weight on her shoulders. "Hey, are you sure you're okay?" he asked. sitting up straighter. You sound, well, not like usual. I'm fine, David, she said quickly, just exhausted. We have flights every day, paperwork, and reports. I get 5 hours of sleep, if I'm lucky. 5 o'clock? He whistled. Lieutenant, you're not made of iron. Tell them to give you the day off. Yeah, right, Linda snorted. I'll tell the colonel that my husband demands a vacation. He'll agree right away. I'm serious, David said, but he smiled. You need to rest. I'm managing, she replied, her voice softening slightly. Look, don't worry, okay? Everything's under control. He wanted to argue, but decided not to press. Linda hated being pitied, even by him. Instead, he changed the subject. Remember our agreement? He said. You promised to send me a photo of you in that stupid helmet. Oh God, Linda laughed, and this time it was genuine. I told you I looked like an idiot in it. So, David grinned. I want to see my wife in combat gear. That's cool. Cool, she chuckled. It's a heavy thing. It hurts your neck. But okay, I'll think about it. Just don't you dare show it to Sam. He'll laugh for the rest of his life. No promises, he said, and they both laughed. David leaned back, holding the phone. Linda's laughter was a breath of fresh air. He missed her voice, her habit of rolling her eyes when he joked, the way she'd sit on the porch with lemonade while he worked on the grill. These calls were their only connection, and he clung to them like a lifeline. Tell me what's new with you, Linda said. How's your truck doing? Has it fallen apart yet? You're insulting me, he replied, patting the steering wheel. My Peterbilt is as good as new. I was driving parts to Tucson yesterday and almost got stuck on the pass. The road was crap, but I managed. My hero, she said with mock pride. What else? Is everything in the house all right? Yeah, David nodded, though she couldn't see him. I watered your flowers like you asked. One of the cacti looks suspiciously dead, though. A cactus. Linda gasped. David, how can you kill a cactus? I tried, he spread his hands. Maybe he just misses you. She laughed again, and David felt his heart clench. He wanted to tell her how much he missed her, how empty the house was without her, but he swallowed the words. Linda didn't like sentimentality, especially now that she was thousands of miles away in the thick of army life. Listen, he said instead. I was thinking, when you get back, we'll go to Colorado like we planned. We'll find a lake house, roast marshmallows. Marshmallows? Her voice perked up. You know, I eat them raw. That's sacrilege, David said, shaking his head. Marshmallows are supposed to be roasted until they turn black. Ugh, Linda laughed. You're a barbarian. But okay, Colorado sounds good, just without your fishing. Agreed, he smiled. Just you, me, and a bunch of marshmallows. They chatted for another 10 minutes about small things, about Linda's paperwork at the base, about David's near fight with another driver over parking, about how she wanted a new coffee maker when she got back. But then her voice grew quieter, and David heard someone calling her name in the background. Linda, you are needed in the hangar. A male voice, sharp, with an army accent. I'm coming, she called to the side, then returned to the phone. David, I have to run. Already? He frowned, looking at his watch. They had been talking for less than 20 minutes. Yes, she said, a note of irritation creeping into her voice. Everything is on schedule here. Sorry. It's okay, he replied, although everything inside him was clenched. Call me when you can. Of course, Linda said. I miss you, Clark. Me too, he answered quietly. Take care of yourself, okay? Always, she chuckled, but her voice was warm. I love you. I love you, David said, and the connection was cut off. He stared at the phone until the screen went blank. The silence in the cab grew louder, except for the hum of the heater and the distant hum of another truck. David put the phone down on the seat, rubbed his face with his hands, and took a deep breath. She was fine, she had called, she had laughed. But something in her voice, the weariness, the rush had troubled him. He told himself it was nothing, that the army was exhausting, that she could handle it. Linda always did. David Clark parked his truck in a gas station lot in New Mexico, somewhere between Albuquerque and Las Cruces. It was early August 2005, and the heat was so hot the asphalt was melting under his feet. He turned off the engine, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his t-shirt, and glanced at the phone on the passenger seat. The Nokia screen was dark, with no missed calls. Linda hadn't called in 3 days, even though she'd promised to call on Wednesday. Today was Friday, and David felt a tingle of unease building inside him. He reached for the bottle of water, but it was warm, almost hot. He grimaced, took a sip, and pulled a pack of cigarettes from the glove compartment. He lit one, even though he knew Linda would roll her eyes and give him a health lecture. But she wasn't there, and the cigarette helped calm his nerves. David blew smoke out the open window, looking at the flashing gas station sign gas and snacks. The cabin smelled of leather, gasoline, and his own sweat after 10 hours behind the wheel. Linda had been in Iraq for 6 months now. For the first few months, they called each other almost every day, sometimes twice if she had a gap between shifts. Her voice, even when tired, was like an anchor that kept him afloat. But something had changed in the last couple of months. The calls became less frequent once a week, sometimes once every 10 days. When she answered, she spoke briefly, as if she were in a hurry, and avoided details. David wondered if he was being paranoid, but every missed call hit him like a hammer. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he reached her name, Linda, and pressed call. The beeps lasted a long time, then the voicemail came on. David sighed, took a drag on his cigarette, and left a message. "Hey, it's me. Just checking to see if you're okay. Call me when you can. Love you." He hung up and tossed the phone onto the seat. His chest felt heavy, but he told himself it was nothing. Linda was on a military base in another country with a lot to do. Of course she was busy. Of course she was tired. He had served in the military himself. He knew how the army squeezed out all the juices. But something still gnawed at him inside. David finished his cigarette, threw the butt into an empty Coke can, and decided to go into the convenience store at the gas station. His legs were numb and his stomach was growling. He hadn't eaten since morning, except for a Snickers bar. It was cool inside the store, the air conditioner humming like an old refrigerator. Behind the cash register stood a guy in his 20s with long hair and an eyebrow piercing, leafing through a magazine about cars. "Good evening," David said, heading toward the refrigerator. "Yeah," the guy nodded, without looking up from the magazine. David picked up a bottle of Coke, a bag of chips, and a sandwich in a plastic wrapper. At the checkout, he noticed a rack of postcards, cheap ones with desert scenes and captions like "Greetings from New Mexico." He picked one with a cactus and a sunset, thinking he'd send it to Linda. She loved little things like that, always pinned them to the fridge. "Is that all?" the guy asked, ringing up the purchases. "Yes, and this postcard." David put it on the counter. "Cool," the guy shrugged. "Someone's lucky if you send postcards." "My wife," David said, taking out his wallet. "She's far away." "Got it," the guy nodded. "My girlfriend also left for college. She calls once a month, if I'm lucky." David chuckled, but said nothing. He paid, picked up his groceries, and returned to the truck. He got behind the wheel and opened a sandwich, but he didn't feel like eating. Instead, he took a pen from the glove compartment and began writing on a postcard. "Linda, I found this at the gas station. Reminded me of our picnic by the lake. Miss you. Call, David." He put the card in his jacket pocket, deciding to send it tomorrow. Maybe it would make her smile. He turned on the radio, but the country song only made him feel more sad, so he turned it off. The silence was worse, but better than whining about broken hearts. The phone vibrated, and David grabbed it so fast he almost dropped it. The screen flashed. Lindoff pressed the answer button, his heart pounding. "Linda," he said, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hi." Her voice was quiet, hoarse, as if she had just woken up. "Sorry I didn't call." "Nothing," he replied, although he wanted to ask why she had disappeared. The main thing is that you're okay. How are you? It's fine, she said. It's just a lot of work. Reports, flights, everything. Yes, you did. David tried to smile, but it came out stiffly. What's new? Tell me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. He heard Linda sigh, then a rustling sound as if she was moving the phone. Nothing special, she said finally. Same old. Heat, dust, lots of papers. Sounds fun, he tried to joke. Maybe I could give you a few lessons in relaxation. Ha, Linda chuckled, but there was no laughter. Maybe it should be. And what about you? I'm going to Las Cruces, he said. It's hot as hell, but the truck's holding up. I bought you a postcard with a cactus. With the cactus, her voice perked up a little. Do you remember how I killed that cactus at home? How could you forget? David laughed. I still blame you for his death. Hey, he gave himself up, she said, and for a second it seemed like everything was back to normal. But then there was another pause. David waited for her to say something else, to ask about home, about his flights, but Linda was silent. He could hear her breathing, distant and quiet, and it only increased his anxiety. Hey, he said, trying to sound light. Remember when we were planning Colorado? I found a brochure about lake houses. I can send it to you. Yeah, she answered, but without enthusiasm. Come on, I'll have a look. Listen, Linda, he couldn't resist. Are you sure you're okay? You're not quite right. I'm fine, David, her voice sharpened. I'm just tired. Don't start, okay? He clutched the phone, feeling the words catch in his throat. He wanted to say that he missed her, that he was worried, that these short calls were all he had. But he knew Linda would brush him off, as she always did, if he pushed too hard. Okay, he said finally. Just call more often, okay? I'll try, she answered, more softly. Sorry, it's really a madhouse here. I understand, he said, although he wasn't sure he understood. Take care of yourself. You too, Linda said. I love you. I love you, he replied, but she had already hung up. David stared at his phone until the screen went blank. He dropped it on the seat, rubbed his face with his hands, and leaned back. The cabin was hot, despite the night, and he opened the window wider. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to howl, then died down. He told himself that Linda was just tired. The army was no joke, especially in Iraq. He himself remembered how exhausting his service in the Persian Gulf had been, how he hadn't wanted to talk to anyone, even his loved ones. But her short answers, her haste, it didn't sound like the Linda he knew. He took out his wallet and pulled out their wedding photograph. Linda was laughing, her eyes shining, and he looked at her as if she were a miracle. David ran his finger over the picture, then put it away. He started the engine, turned on the headlights, and pulled out onto the highway. David Clark stood at the stove in their small house outside Austin, stirring eggs in a frying pan. It was a Saturday morning in June 2006, and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. The radio on the windowsill played country music softly, and the sun streamed through the window, illuminating the worn wooden table where he and Linda ate almost every day. Today was a special day. Linda had returned from Iraq 2 days ago, and for the first time in a year they were home together. David glanced at his watch. Almost 9 and Linda was still asleep upstairs, so he decided to make breakfast, like old times. The year apart had been hard. The calls that had started out as daily became infrequent, sometimes every 2 weeks, by the end of her deployment. Linda attributed it to work, to fatigue, to the poor reception at Tallow Air Force Base. David believed because he wanted to believe. He missed her laughter, her habit of teasing him, the way she'd sit on the porch with lemonade while he worked on the grill. Now that she was home, he felt like life was finally getting back to normal. The upstairs bedroom door creaked, and David heard footsteps. Linda came down to the kitchen, wearing his old army t-shirt and shorts, her hair mussed from sleep. She looked thinner than he remembered, with slight shadows under her eyes, but she was still his Linda, the one who took his breath away. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he said, smiling and nodding toward the frying pan. Eggs, toast, coffee, just like the best of times. You got up for this? Linda yawned, stretching. You could have woken me up. I would have helped. I wanted to spoil you, he replied, transferring the scrambled eggs to a plate. Sit down. Everything is ready. Linda sat at the table, drawing her knees up to her chest, and took the mug of coffee he placed in front of her. She took a sip and closed her eyes, as if tasting it for the first time in a year. God, how I miss normal coffee, she said. The base had some kind of slop that made my teeth grind. I told you you get spoiled with my coffee maker, David winked, sitting down opposite him with a plate of toast. Eat it, it'll get cold. They ate, talking about small things. Linda told him about the base, the heat, the sand that clogged everything, the time she'd been stuck in a hangar for 3 hours when her equipment failed. David shared stories from his flights, the time he'd nearly hit a deer in Oklahoma, the time his truck stalled in the desert and he'd had to fix it under the stars. They laughed, and for a moment it was like before, like that weekend before she'd left, when they'd grilled steaks and argued about music. Listen, David said, pushing his empty plate away. I was thinking maybe we could go to the lake today, a picnic like the good old days. The lake? Linda raised an eyebrow, but smiled. You just want me to fall in the water again, like last time. You jumped in yourself, he laughed. I just suggested we go for a swim. Yeah, sure, she shook her head, but her eyes were shining. Okay, go ahead, but I'm taking the blanket and none of your beer. Deal, he said, feeling warmth in his chest. Just don't forget your stupid sunscreen. Linda snorted and finished her coffee. David looked at her and wanted to freeze this moment, her smile, her voice, their kitchen, where everything was right. After breakfast, they cleared the dishes together, and Linda even joked that he was bad at washing the dishes, as usual. They packed a picnic basket, sandwiches, chips, lemonade, and drove to Lake Travis, an hour away. The lake was crowded, but they found a quiet spot by the water, spread out a blanket, and settled under a tree. Linda took off her sneakers, pulled her knees up, and looked at the water while David opened the lemonade. He noticed that she was silent longer than usual, her gaze far away. Hey, he said, handing her the bottle. Where are you? Here, Linda blinked and took the lemonade. It's just beautiful here. I forgot what it's like to just sit and do nothing. Yeah, David nodded, sitting down next to him. I suppose there was no time for picnics in Iraq. No time for picnics, she agreed, but her voice was quieter than he expected. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but decided not to press. Instead, he tugged at her hand, and they lay down on the blanket, looking up at the clouds. Linda leaned against his shoulder, and David wrapped his arms around her, feeling her warmth. They lay there, talking about nothing, about how he wanted a new fishing rod, how she wanted a dog when they had more time. But a couple of times he caught her looking at him empty, like she wasn't quite there with him. They returned home in the evening, tired but happy. Linda went to take a shower, and David turned on the TV, flipping through the channels. When she came out, in a towel, with wet hair, he turned off the sound and smiled. Come here, he said, patting the sofa. Let me at least get dressed. Linda rolled her eyes, but sat down next to him, still wrapped in a towel. He put his arms around her, and she didn't resist. They began to kiss, slowly at first, then more passionately. David felt the year of separation dissolving in her breath, in her arms around his neck. They went up to the bedroom, and the next hours were like coming home, passionate, intimate, just the way he dreamed they'd be. Linda laughed when he nearly fell out of bed, and he teased her for stealing all the blankets. By morning, they were asleep, entwined, and David was sure everything would be okay. But something was different on Sunday. Linda was up early, sitting in the kitchen on the phone when David came down. She looked tense, her fingers tapping on her mug. Good morning, he said, kissing the top of her head. Coffee again? Yeah, she replied without looking up. I need to wake up. Already awake, he sat down opposite her. Is something wrong? No, she said quickly. "It's just," the base called. "We need to stop by tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" David frowned. "You just got back." "It won't be for long," Linda shrugged, looking into her mug. "Reports, paperwork." He wanted to argue, to say that she deserved a break, but her tone stopped him. It wasn't harsh, but distant, like a part of her was still somewhere back there on the base in Iraq. "Okay," he said finally, "but you're mine tonight. Maybe we can order pizza." "We'll see," she replied, her smile weak. The rest of the day passed quietly. They watched a movie, but Linda kept checking her phone. David tried to joke, offered to play cards, but she answered shortly, as if her thoughts were on something else. By evening, she had packed her bag, saying that he would spend the night at the base so as not to have to travel in the morning. "Already?" David asked, standing in the doorway. "I thought you were going to be home for a couple of weeks." "I'll be back soon," Linda said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "It's just work, David." "I understand," he replied, although his chest ached. "Call me when you get there." "Okay," she nodded, kissed him on the cheek, and walked to the car. David Clark sat behind the wheel of his truck, looking out over the endless ribbon of I-20 that stretched across West Texas. It was mid-September 2010, and the evening air was warm despite the fall. The cab smelled of coffee from a thermos and old leather seats. The radio played an old Tom Petty song softly, but David was barely listening. He had just finished a trip from Dallas to El Paso and was now on his way home to their suburban home in Austin. His thoughts were on Linda, as they always were when he was on the road. It had been 4 years since she had returned from Iraq. Their marriage, once full of laughter and plans, was now like a truck on autopilot moving forward, but without the same fire. Linda worked at Fort Hood, an army base 2 hours away, and often stayed overnight, citing late shifts or training exercises. David had grown accustomed to her absences, but each time she left, the house felt empty, like an abandoned gas station. He reached for his cell phone, a battered BlackBerry now, and checked his messages. Nothing. Linda had promised to call yesterday, but she hadn't. David frowned, but told himself she was busy. She was always busy. He dialed her number, but after 3 rings, his voicemail came on. He didn't leave a message. What was the point if she'd call back whenever she wanted? David tossed his phone onto the passenger seat and took a sip of coffee. The thermos was nearly empty and the coffee was cold, but he drank anyway to stay awake. It had been a long drive, and he hadn't slept well in days. Trucking was grueling, but he loved the freedom of it. No bosses, just him, the truck, and the highway. Still, on nights like this, the loneliness rolled in like a heavy weight. He remembered a weekend he and Linda had spent last month. She had only been home for 2 days, and they had decided to have a barbecue, like old times. David was grilling steaks, Linda was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, but the conversation was slow. She was smiling, joking, but her eyes were far away, and she kept checking her phone. When he asked what was wrong, she waved him off. "It's just work, David. You know how it is." "I know," he replied, turning the meat over. "But you're home. Maybe you could forget about the base for a couple of hours?" They ate and watched a movie, but Linda went to bed early, citing a headache. David stayed on the couch, watching TV, wondering when everything had become so distant. He still loved her, so much that it was sometimes frightening. But Linda seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. By midnight, David had pulled up to the house. Their small house outside Austin looked the same as always. The lawn was mown, the Texas flag hung on the porch light he'd left on. But Linda's truck was missing. She'd said she'd be back at the base until tomorrow, but he still hoped she'd be home before then. David turned off the engine, climbed out, and stretched, cracking his back. He was tired, but not tired enough to go to bed right away. It was quiet inside the house. David dropped his keys on the hall table, took off his shoes, and walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator was almost empty. A couple of beers, some leftover pizza, some yogurt Linda liked. He took the beer, opened it, and sat at the table, looking at their wedding photo pinned to the bulletin board. Linda was laughing, and he looked at her as if she were a miracle. David ran his finger over the picture, then took a sip of beer. He decided to do some laundry to keep his hands occupied. In the bedroom, he gathered up the dirty clothes from the hamper, including a few of Linda's things, her uniform shirt, jeans, and a couple of t-shirts. As he checked the pockets, a folded piece of paper fell out of the jeans. David unfolded it and saw a handwritten phone number, no name. It was a local number with an Austin area code, but he didn't recognize it. David froze, holding the paper. His first thought was that it was a colleague from base or someone from work. But why no name? Why in his jeans pocket and not in her phone? He felt a twinge of alarm, but pushed it away. Linda was his wife. They had been together for almost 7 years. She wouldn't. He didn't even let himself finish the thought. Nonsense, he muttered, crumpling the paper and throwing it in the trash. But the doubt remained. David threw his clothes in the washing machine, turned it on, and walked back into the living room. He sat on the couch and turned on the TV, but he didn't watch. Instead, he thought about Linda, about how she had changed since Iraq. She was still the same Linda, witty, strong, with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. But her frequent absences, her silences, her distant gaze, it all added up to a picture he didn't want to see. He remembered their last normal conversation, a couple of weeks ago. Linda was at home, drinking coffee on the veranda, and he was trying to get her to talk. "Listen," he said, holding the mug. "Maybe you should take a vacation. Let's go somewhere, like before." Vacation. Linda raised an eyebrow, but didn't smile. "David, you know how it works. I have projects. I can't just leave." "I know," he replied, trying not to sound irritated. "But you're always at the base. We hardly see each other." "That's my job," she said, looking away. "You were in the army yourself." "I was," he nodded, "but I came back. And you, it's like you're still there." Linda looked at him, and for a second he thought she wanted to say something. But then she just shrugged. "I'm here, David," she said quietly. "Just give me time, okay?" "Okay," he replied, clutching his mug. "I'm always waiting." She smiled, but it was a weak smile, and soon she was gone back to base, leaving him alone. David had told himself then that she was just tired, that the army was exhausting. But now, sitting in an empty house, with that phone number in his head, he wasn't so sure. He stood up, walked over to the trash can, and pulled out the paper. He unfolded it, looked at the numbers. He could call, ask who it was. But what would he say? "Hey, this is Linda's husband. How did she get your number?" That would be stupid. And yet he didn't throw the paper back. Instead, he stuffed it into his jeans pocket, deciding he'd figure it out later. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe it didn't mean anything. David returned to the couch, finished his beer, and turned on the news. He tried to focus on the report on gas prices, but his thoughts kept returning to Linda. He loved her more than he could say. She was his wife, his home, his everything. But her absence, her silence, that phone number, these were shadows he didn't want to acknowledge. He told himself he'd talk to her when she returned. David Clark sat at the kitchen table in their suburban Austin home, staring at the envelope he'd found in the mailbox an hour earlier. It was a Friday night in October 2019, and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. The envelope was white, with neat writing on it. To David, Clark knew what was inside before he even opened it: divorce papers. Linda hadn't called, written, or warned him. She'd just mailed them, like an electric bill. David held the papers in his hands, but he didn't read them. The letters blurred before his eyes. He felt his heart pounding. Linda was at Fort Hood, as usual, and not answering his phone. He tried calling 3 times, but each time he got an answering machine. Her voice on the recording, calm, businesslike, sounded like someone else's. "Leave a message, I'll call you back." He didn't leave. What could he say? Why did you do this? What happened to us? He put the papers down and rubbed his face with his hands. The kitchen smelled of coffee he had brewed but not drunk. On the table was a framed wedding photograph of them, Linda in a white dress, he in a suit, both laughing. David looked at the picture, and his chest ached. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of love, plans, arguments, laughter. And then the envelope that tore it all to shreds. The phone vibrated and David grabbed it, expecting to see Linda's name. But it was Carol, Linda's friend from the base, whom they sometimes saw at barbecues. He frowned but answered. "Carol," he said, pressing the phone to his ear. "David, hi." Her voice was cautious, as if she was afraid to scare him. "Are you okay?" "No," he answered sharply. "Linda sent divorce papers. Do you know what's going on?" "Oh shit," Carol paused, then sighed. "Listen, I wanted to tell you earlier, but I didn't know how." "Say what?" David sat up, feeling his insides go cold. "Carol, tell me straight." She fell silent again, and he heard her clear her throat. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, almost guilty. "Linda, she hasn't been honest with you," Carol said, "ever since Iraq. There, she had connections with other officers, and after she came back, it didn't stop." David felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He clutched the phone so tightly that his fingers turned white. "What did you say?" His voice was hoarse, alien. "I'm sorry, David," Carol said quickly, as if she were afraid he would hang up. "I found out a couple of years ago. She was seeing someone on base, then someone else. I thought she'd stop, but she didn't. I couldn't keep quiet when I found out about the divorce." David was silent, looking at the papers in front of him. His head was noisy, like a truck going full speed. He wanted to tell Carol that she was lying, that Linda couldn't have done it, that it was a mistake. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he asked, "How long ago?" "Since Iraq," Carol answered quietly. "Since 2005. And, onwards. I don't know all the details, but it wasn't a one-off." David closed his eyes, feeling the world crumble. Iraq, 2005. The year the calls became less frequent, when Linda answered curtly, when he chalked her detachment up to stress. He remembered her return in 2006, their passionate weekend, her smile, and her gaze empty, distant, which he hadn't understood then. He remembered 2010, the scrap of paper with a phone number in her jeans that he'd thrown away before he'd dared ask. He remembered her frequent trips to the base, her silence, her phone, which she never left unattended. Red flags. They were everywhere, but he didn't see them. He believed in her, in their love, in their marriage. He was blind because he wanted to be blind. "David?" Carol's voice brought him back to reality. "Are you there?" "Yes," he replied, although he wanted to shout, "Thank you for telling me." "I'm so sorry," she said. "If anything happens, I'm here. Call me if you want to talk." "Yeah," he hung up without waiting for an answer. David threw the phone on the table and stood up, his legs shaking. He went to the sink, turned on the water, splashed it on his face, but the cold didn't help. His chest burned, as if someone had ripped out a piece of his heart. Linda had cheated on him. Not just once, not by accident, but for years. In Iraq, at home, on base. With other men. While he waited for her, while he loved her, he fixed her car and watered her flowers. He returned to the table, picked up the documents, and began to read. The words were dry and legalistic. Divorce, division of property, no complaints. Linda signed them in neat handwriting that he knew by heart. She hadn't asked for anything, not a house, not a car, not money. She just wanted to go. David clutched the papers, feeling them crumple in his hands. He wanted to rip them up, burn them, throw them away. But instead he dropped them on the table and sat down, burying his face in his hands. He remembered their wedding in 2004, her laughter, her hand in his. He remembered the picnics by the lake, their arguments about music, her scent chamomile shampoo that he could still smell in their bedroom. He remembered her coming back from Iraq and him thinking everything would be okay. But even then, there had been signs, her hurried calls, her departures, her silences. He ignored them because he believed she loved him as much as he loved her. He had been a fool. David stood up, grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, and poured himself a glass. He rarely drank strong alcohol, but he doesn't care now. The whiskey burned his throat, but it didn't dull the pain. He looked at the photograph on the table, at their smiles, and felt the anger give way to emptiness. Linda hadn't just left. She had ruined everything they had, and he didn't even know why. He took out his phone and dialed her number again. Answering machine. David clenched his jaw, but left a message. Linda, it's me. I got your papers. We need to talk. Call. He hung up and finished his whiskey. The house was quiet, too quiet. David stood up, walked into the living room, and sat on the couch where he and Linda had watched movies, with her falling asleep on his shoulder. He turned on the TV, but the sound was just noise. Their world had fallen apart, and he didn't know how to pick up the pieces. He had loved her, believed in her, and she had lied to him for years. And all he had left was the envelope on the table and the truth he didn't want to see. David Clark sat on the creaky wooden porch of his new home, if you could call this shack in the middle of nowhere, Texas, a home. It was November 2019, and the evening air smelled of dust and dry grass. The sky was darkening, the first stars peeking out over a field that contained nothing but an old barn and a few gnarled trees. The house he'd bought for pennies after his divorce was small. One bedroom, a kitchen, a living room with a threadbare couch, and a bathroom with a perpetually dripping faucet. But David didn't care. He needed a place where no one would ask questions, and this was it. He held a bottle of Jim Beam whiskey in his hand, half empty. He took a sip, feeling the alcohol burn his throat, and set the bottle on the step next to him. On his lap was an old photo album he'd taken from their Austin home when he sold it. It was tattered, the cover faded, but inside were memories of life he'd had with Linda that he still couldn't let go of. David opened the album to the first page. A wedding photograph. Linda in a white dress, he in a suit, both laughing as if the world belonged to them. He ran his finger over the picture, feeling a tightness in his chest. The divorce had been quick. Linda hadn't shown up for the hearing. Her lawyer had handed over the papers, and it was over. She hadn't called, she hadn't written, she hadn't explained why she'd filed for divorce, why she'd lied to him for years. Carol, her friend, had told him about her infidelities in Iraq, then at home with different men. That had been 3 weeks ago, but the pain hadn't gone away. It had only grown, like rust, eating away at everything inside. He turned the page. A photo from their first picnic at Lake Travis in 2004. Linda, in shorts, holding a bottle of lemonade, laughing as he tried to start a fire. David remembered her teasing him then. "Clark, you're a veteran," she said, throwing a branch onto the fire. "Can't you start a fire?" "I fought in the desert. They didn't light fires there," he replied, grinning. "Give me some matches, smart boy." "Matches?" Linda snorted. "That's for weaklings. Real men rub sticks." They had laughed until they cried, and then sat by the fire, hugging each other, talking about the future, about children, about a bigger house, about the dog Linda wanted. David looked at the photo and felt the whiskey not helping. Why hadn't he seen that everything was falling apart? Why hadn't he noticed her distance, her lies? He remembered the calls from Iraq that grew shorter and shorter, her hurried departures to the base, the phone number in her jeans that he had thrown away before he dared ask. He was blind because he loved her, because he believed she loved him the same way. David took another sip of whiskey and turned the page. A photo from a barbecue in 2008. Linda with a glass of wine, him at the grill, their friends around her. She had been smiling, but he could see now that her eyes were empty. He remembered how she had gone to bed early that night, citing exhaustion, and he had stayed with the guests, thinking everything was fine. How could he have been such an idiot? "You should have asked," he muttered to himself, his voice rough with whiskey and fatigue. "You should have stopped her, talked to her, anything." But he didn't ask. He didn't stop. He worked, he went on trips, he fixed her car, he watered her flowers, he waited for her to come home. He thought their marriage was strong, that they had survived Iraq, that they would be together forever. And she, meanwhile, was living another life with other men, with other smiles that he had never seen. David closed the album, unable to look any further. He stood up, swaying slightly, and walked into the house. The living room was almost empty. A couch, an old television, boxes of things he hadn't yet unpacked. On the coffee table was a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. He lit one, even though he had promised himself he would quit, and sat down on the couch, staring at the dark television screen. The house was too quiet, and the silence weighed on him like a heavy weight. He remembered their last conversation, if it could be called a conversation. A week ago, he had gotten through to Linda after a dozen attempts. She had answered, but her voice was cold, businesslike. "David, I got your message," she said. "We have nothing to talk about." "Nothing?" He clutched the phone, feeling his anger boiling. "You sent me divorce papers, Linda. You didn't explain anything to me." "I don't want to argue," she replied. "It's over. I'm sorry if this hurts." "Forgive me," he almost shouted. "You lied to me for years. Carol told me about Iraq, about everything. Why, Linda?" "I have to go," she said, and the connection was cut off. She didn't call back. David sat in their old house, looking at her things, her books, her clothes, her coffee maker, and knew she hadn't left now, but years ago. He'd sold the house, taken only the album and a few boxes, and moved here, to this wilderness where no one knew his name. He stubbed out his cigarette in an empty beer can and picked up a bottle of whiskey. He took another sip, then another. The alcohol didn't dull the pain, but it dulled it, like an old wound. David opened the album again, to a random page. A photo from their trip to Colorado in 2007. Linda by a lake, wearing his jacket, laughing as he took pictures. He remembered how they'd talked about having kids. "How much do you want?" she asked, sitting by the fire. "Two," he replied, throwing on more wood. "A boy and a girl. And you?" "Two, too," Linda smiled. "But only if you learn to change diapers." "I'm a veteran," he said, grinning. "I'm not afraid of diapers." They had laughed, they had made plans, and he had been happy. But now he wondered, had she been happy, or had she already been thinking about someone else? He slammed the album shut, threw it on the table, and buried his face in his hands. He was 45, alone, in a house that was barely holding together, with a bottle of whiskey and a pile of memories that burned like acid. "Where did I go wrong?" he asked out loud, although there was no answer. He stood up, walked into the bedroom, and lay down on the mattress, which smelled of dampness. The ceiling is stained, but he looked at it like it held answers. He thought about Linda, how she had changed since Iraq, how he hadn't noticed, how he hadn't wanted to notice. He thought about the years he'd spent loving her, believing in her, while she'd ruined their lives. And he thought about himself, how to live now that everything he had was gone. David closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he saw her face, her smile, her lies. The house was empty, and she was empty with him. David Clark stood at the checkout counter of a small country store 10 miles from his new home. It was December 2019, and a cold rain was falling outside, turning the dirt road into mud. The store was the only one in the area, its sign peeling. General store and shelves filled with canned goods, beer, and odds and ends. David placed a pack of cigarettes, a can of coffee, and a couple of frozen burritos on the counter. He had rarely left the house since moving to this wilderness after his divorce, but he had run out of supplies and had to go. The cashier, an older woman with gray hair, scanned the items, casting curious glances at him. David was used to this outsiders, always attracted attention in small towns. He silently handed over a 20, took the change, and was about to turn to leave when he heard a familiar voice. "Clark, David Clark, is that you?" David turned to see Tom Ridley, Linda's old Fort Hood comrade. Tom was a big guy with a crew cut and an eagle tattoo on his forearm that showed through the sleeve of his jacket. They had met a couple of times at barbecues at their house about 5 years ago, when Linda was still inviting coworkers. David nodded, not particularly happy to see him. "Tom," he said, shaking the outstretched hand. "Long time no see." "Yeah," Tom smiled, but his eyes were wary. "What are you doing in this hole?" I live here, David answered briefly, stuffing his groceries into a bag. I moved here recently. And you? Just passing through, Tom said, nodding at his truck outside the window. Getting a delivery for the store. Hey, I heard about, you and Linda. Sorry, bro. David tensed, clutching the bag. He didn't want to talk about the divorce, especially with someone who knew Linda. But Tom didn't seem to be keeping quiet. Thank you, David said, hoping to end the conversation. I have to go. Wait, Tom lowered his voice, stepping closer. Do you even know what's going on with her? David froze, his stomach clenching. He hadn't seen Linda since he'd signed the divorce papers 2 months ago. She hadn't called or written, and he tried not to think about her, even though it was impossible. What do you mean? He asked, looking Tom in the eyes. Well, Tom hesitated, scratching the back of his head. There are rumors. I didn't want to butt in, but since you're here. Anyway, she got involved with some shady guys in Austin. Shady types? David frowned, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. Speak more clearly, Tom. Okay, Tom sighed, looking around as if he was afraid someone would overhear them. People say she does women's services for men, or something like that. Dates rich guys, lives in some apartment downtown. I don't know for sure, but that doesn't sound like the Linda we knew. David felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He squeezed the bag so hard that the plastic creaked. Linda, his Linda, the Air Force officer, the woman he had loved for 15 years. It was like a punch in the gut, worse than when Carol had told him about the cheating. He wanted to tell Tom he was lying, that it was nonsense, but the words stuck in his throat. How do you know that? He asked, his voice hoarse. Rumors, Tom shrugged, but he looked guilty. Some guy from the base saw her in Austin, at some bar with a guy who, didn't look like her friend. Then someone else said something. I thought you should know. David was silent, looking at Tom. Anger boiled inside him, but not at him, at Linda, at himself, at everything that had brought them here. He remembered her smile at their wedding, her laughter by the lake, their nights together, and now this. How had she gotten to this point, and why did part of him still want to protect her? Thank you, he said finally, though each word was difficult. I have to go. Listen, David, Tom followed him to the door. If anything happens, call me. I'm serious. This is shitty, I know. Yeah, David nodded without turning around and walked out into the rain. He climbed into his old pickup, threw the bag on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The windshield wipers squealed, smearing water across the glass. David sat there, watching the road, but didn't move. Tom's words played in his head like a broken record escort. Shady types. Doesn't sound like Linda. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling his anger give way to something else: pity, pain, emptiness. At home, he dropped his groceries on the kitchen table and pulled a bottle of whiskey out of the cabinet. He poured himself a glass, then another, not caring that it was past midnight. He sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, but the sound was just background noise. He could see Linda's face in his head, not the one at the bar with some guy, but the one he knew. Linda, who teased him about burning his steaks. Linda, who sang along to the radio in their kitchen. Linda promised to love him forever. He recalled a conversation they had in 2006, shortly after she returned from Iraq. They were sitting on the veranda, drinking coffee, and he was trying to get her to talk. Did you miss me? He asked, looking at her. Of course, she replied, but her smile was weak. You know. I don't know, he said, only half joking. You're a big boss at the base now. Maybe you've forgotten your truck driver. Never, Linda poked him in the shoulder, but her eyes looked past him. I'm here, David. Everything's fine. He believed. He always believed. Even when she left for the base, even when he found that phone number in her jeans, even when she filed for divorce. And now this, an escort. David took another sip of whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn. He was angry at her for lying, for cheating, for ruining their lives. But he was more angry at himself for not seeing, for not asking, for not stopping her. And somewhere deep inside, he pitied her. Linda was strong, smart, and proud. What had broken her so much that she had come to this? He stood up, walked into the bedroom, and pulled out a box of their old things. Inside was a photo album he hadn't opened since the move. David sat on the floor, opened it, and began flipping through it. The wedding, the picnics, the trips. Each photo was a knife in the heart. He stopped at a picture from their barbecue in 2008. Linda had been smiling, but now he could see that her smile was fake. He had missed it then, missed all the signs. "Why, Linda?" he asked out loud, looking at the photo. "What did I do wrong?" There was no answer. David closed the album, finished his whiskey, and lay down on the bed, not undressing. The rain pounded the roof, and the house seemed even emptier. He felt anger, pity, love all mixed into a lump that suffocated him. Linda had fallen, and he didn't know how to accept it. But the worst thing was that he still loved her, even after everything, and that hurt the most. David Clark sat in his pickup truck in the parking lot of a community center in a small town an hour from his home. It was January 2020, and a cold wind whipped dust across the pavement. The building looked like an old warehouse converted into a meeting space. Peeling paint, a sign community center with one letter gone. There was a veterans support group going on inside, and David still didn't understand why he was there. His friend Sam, with whom he had served in the Persian Gulf, had been calling for 3 weeks, trying to persuade him to come. "Just try it," Sam said over the phone. "Sitting alone in your hut like a hermit. That's not right, brother." "I'm fine," David replied, although they both knew it was a lie. "It's not okay," Sam was adamant. "Come. Look, if you don't like it, I won't invite you again." David sighed, looking at the entrance. He didn't want to share his pain with strangers. His divorce from Linda, her infidelities, the rumors that she had gotten involved with shady people, maybe was an escort, it all sat inside him like a rusty nail. He drank more than he should, slept poorly, and the days blurred into a gray mess of flights and whiskey. But Sam was right. He couldn't hide forever. David turned off the engine, stuffed a pack of cigarettes into his jacket pocket, and got out. The center smelled of coffee and old carpet. It was a small room with about a dozen folding chairs arranged in a circle. On a table in the corner were paper cups, a coffee pot, and a box of donuts. About 7 people were already sitting there, talking or looking at their phones. David felt out of place, but there was no turning back. He picked up a cup of coffee, mostly to keep his hands busy, and sat down in the far corner of the circle. The presenter, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a warm smile, entered the room and clapped her hands. "Good evening, everyone," she said. "My name is Mary Thompson, and it's nice to see familiar faces and new ones. Just sharing today, as usual. No pressure, just if you want. Who's going to start?" David looked down at his coffee, hoping to go unnoticed. He wasn't going to talk. He'd be happy to just sit there for an hour and then leave. But Mary seemed to notice him. She looked at him with a small smile, but didn't press, instead nodding at the man across from her. "I'll start," said the other, a guy in his 30s with a prosthetic right leg. "Josh, Afghanistan vet. I've been sleeping lousy for the last couple of weeks. The nightmares are back, that damn convoy again." Josh spoke softly, but everyone listened. He told how he had lost his leg in an ambush, how he could still hear explosions in his sleep. David looked at him, feeling a pang of guilt. His own problems, the divorce, Linda's betrayal seemed small in comparison. But Josh's pain was familiar. David had seen war too, and knew how it clings to you, even after years. The next to speak was a woman of about 40, with a long braid and a tattoo on her wrist. "Amy, Iraq, 2007, she said. "I'm doing okay, but my husband left last week. He said he couldn't deal with my breakdowns anymore. I don't blame him, but it still sucks." David tensed when he heard about the divorce. He knew the feeling when someone you love just walks away. He remembered Linda, her cold voice in their last conversation. "We have nothing to talk about, David," she said then. "It's over." "Is it over?" He almost shouted. You've been lying to me for years, Linda. Why? I have to go, she replied and hung up. He squeezed the cup, feeling the cardboard crumple. Mary noticed the movement but said nothing, just nodded for Amy to continue. Amy talked about how she was trying to cope, how she was seeing a therapist, how she was learning to live alone. David listened, but his thoughts kept returning to Linda. He still couldn't understand how she, an officer, strong, smart, had ended up getting involved with some shady characters, maybe even an escort. It was like a knife in the heart, but he still loved her, and that was the worst thing. When Amy finished, Mary glanced around the circle. Her eyes landed on David, and he felt his insides tighten. A new face, she said softly. Want to introduce yourself? No pressure, just a name if you feel comfortable. David, he said, looking at the floor. Persian Gulf, 91. I just came to listen. Okay, David, Mary nodded, and there was no judgment in her voice. I'm glad you're here. She switched to another participant, and David exhaled. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to spill his guts in front of these people. But the stories of the others were compelling. One guy, a Vietnam veteran, told how he'd lost his brother in combat and still blamed himself. A woman who'd served in Iraq talked about how her daughter was afraid of her outbursts. Everyone was carrying their own pain, and David began to understand why Sam insisted on this group. No one pretended everything was okay here. When the meeting was over, Mary announced a coffee break. David stood up to leave, but Mary came up to him holding her cup. David, right? She said, smiling. Thank you for coming. The first time is always the hardest. Yeah, he shrugged, avoiding her gaze. I'm not sure I'll be back. I understand, Mary nodded. I didn't want to come here either when I lost my husband. He was in Afghanistan and died in 2010. I thought I didn't belong among those who fought, but it helps. David looked at her. Mary was older than she seemed, with wrinkles around her eyes and a calm voice that did not press. Her words about her husband touched something in him. He had not lost Linda because of the war, but her betrayal, her fall that was its own war, which still tore him apart. I sympathize, he said, about your husband. Thank you, Mary smiled. And you. If you want to talk, we're here every Tuesday. Or just come for coffee. It's lousy, but it's free. David chuckled, almost smiling. We'll see, he said. I'm not much of a talker. Nothing, she replied. David Clark sat on a folding chair in the community center, clutching a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. It was March 2020, and outside the window a drizzle was pounding the tin roof. Inside, the smell of damp and cheap coffee lingered in the circle of 10 veterans, waiting to see who would speak first. This was his 5th support group meeting, and so far David had been silently listening. The stories of others of war, of loss, of nightmares tugged at his heartstrings, but he held himself aloof, unwilling to spill the beans. Mary Thompson, the group leader, sat across from him, her warm smile familiar. She was a widow who had lost her husband in Afghanistan, and her calm acted as an anchor for David. In previous meetings, he had simply sat there, nodding when she asked him to speak, but today something was different. Maybe it was the dream he had had last night, of Linda, not the one who had lied to him, but the one who had laughed at their wedding. Maybe it was the whiskey he had stopped drinking a week ago because he was tired of waking up with a headache. He didn't know. But when Mary glanced around the circle and asked who wanted to start, David felt he couldn't stay silent any longer. I'll try, he said, his voice hoarse, and he cleared his throat. Everyone turned to look at him, and he wished he hadn't spoken. But it was too late to back out. David Clark, Gulf 91. I don't know where to begin. Start with how you feel, Mary said softly. No one judges here. David nodded, looking into his cup. His hands were shaking, and he squeezed them to steady them. My ex-wife, Linda, he began. She was an Air Force officer. In 2005, she was deployed to Iraq to Tel El Air Force Base. We were married for a year. Everything was fine. I thought we could handle the separation. He fell silent, remembering their calls, her tired voice, her laughter that was becoming less frequent. He didn't want to tell her everything about the cheating, about the rumors that she was now living with some shady people, maybe working as an escort. But he knew he had to be honest, at least partly. She came back in 2006, he continued. I thought everything would be fine. But she changed. She became distant, always at the base. I worked as a truck driver, went on trips, thought it was stress, the army, all that. But last year she filed for divorce, without explanation. Then I found out that she was with other people, also in Iraq and after, for years. His voice shook and he fell silent, feeling his throat tighten. The room was silent, except for the rain on the roof. He waited for judgment, ridicule, but no one moved. Mary looked at him with sympathy, and Josh, the guy with the prosthetic, nodded as if he understood. I didn't see it, David said more quietly. There were signs, calls, departures, even a phone number in her things. But I believed her. I loved her. And now, I live alone in a house that's falling apart, and I don't know what to do next. He paused, feeling he had said too much. But at the same time he felt lighter, as if some of the weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Mary leaned forward, her voice calm. Thank you, David, she said. It's hard to share. You're not the only one who's lost someone close to you to war. It's not always the bullet that kills. Sometimes it's what war does to your soul. David nodded, but her words stung. He had never thought of Linda as a casualty of war. She had been strong, an officer, always in control. But now he remembered the look in her eyes after Iraq, empty, distant, as if part of her had remained there. Josh spoke next. My sister, he said, looking at the floor. She served in Iraq, came back in 2009. She started drinking, then she got hooked on pills. We tried to help, but she pushed everyone away. War, it doesn't just break those who are there, it breaks those around you. I still blame myself for not getting her out. Amy, the woman with the braid, added, my father was in Vietnam. He never talked about the war, but he drank every night. My mother left when I was 10 because she couldn't take it anymore. I thought he was a weakling until I joined the army myself. Now I understand that the war took him there. David listened, and their words were like a mirror. He remembered Linda in 2006, when she returned. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't breaking down, but her silence, her distance, maybe that was her way of coping. He remembered their conversation on the porch, when he tried to get her to talk. Are you okay? He asked then, holding her hand. Yes, she answered, but she didn't look at him. I'm just tired, David. Give me time. I always give, he said, trying to smile. But tell me if anything happens. I'm here. I know, she squeezed his hand, but her voice was empty. He thought then that she simply needed time. But what if she was carrying something she couldn't talk about? What if Iraq had broken her in ways he couldn't see? Mary spoke, her voice soft but firm. War changes everyone, she said. I lost my husband, but even before he died, he wasn't the same person he was before Afghanistan. He didn't sleep, he didn't talk, he kept everything inside. I blamed myself for not helping. But sometimes, people break, and we can't fix them. She looked at David, and he felt like she was talking to him. Your Linda, Mary continued, you said she changed after Iraq. Maybe she was carrying trauma she didn't show. That doesn't excuse what she did, but sometimes people do terrible things because they don't know any other way to cope. David squeezed his cup, feeling Mary's words hit home. He was angry at Linda for the cheating, for the divorce, for the rumors that she was involved with shady people, maybe even an escort. But now he wondered, was she as broken as Josh, as Amy, as Mary's husband? He had never asked, never insisted, thinking she could handle it on her own. Had he failed her, not recognizing her pain? I don't know, he said out loud, looking at Mary. I thought she was strong. She was an officer. Mary continued, her voice soft but firm. War changes everyone, she said. I lost my husband, but even before he died, he wasn't the same person he was before Afghanistan. He didn't sleep, he didn't talk, he kept everything inside. I blamed myself for not helping. But sometimes people break and we can't fix them. She looked at David and he felt like she was talking to him. Your Linda, Mary continued. You said she changed after Iraq. Maybe she was carrying trauma she didn't show. It doesn't excuse what she did, but sometimes we don't know how else to cope. David squeezed his cup, feeling Mary's words hit home. He was angry at Linda for her cheating, for the divorce, for the rumors that she was now living with some shady people, maybe working as an escort. But now he wondered, was she as broken as Josh, as Amy, as Mary's husband? He had never asked, never insisted, thinking she could handle it on her own. Had he failed her, not recognizing her pain? I don't know, he said out loud, looking at Mary. I thought she was strong. She was an officer, always in control. Strong people break down too, Mary replied. Sometimes they just hide it better. David was silent, processing her words. He remembered Linda in Iraq, her short calls, her tired voice. He chalked it up to stress, to the army. But what if it was more? What if she saw things she didn't talk about? He remembered her return in 2006, the blank look in her eyes sometimes, the way she waved him off when he asked if she was okay. I had to do something, he said quietly, almost to himself. I had to ask. We all think that, Josh said, looking at him. I thought if I'd talked to my sister more, she wouldn't have snapped. But you can't blame yourself for everything. Mary nodded. You can't carry her pain, David, she said. You can only carry your own. And you're here, you're talking. That's a step. The meeting continued, others sharing their stories, but David was only half listening. His thoughts were on Linda, not her betrayals, not the rumors, but the fact that perhaps he didn't know her as well as he thought. He was still angry, still hurt, but for the first time he saw her not just as a traitor, but as someone who could be broken by war just as he had been. When the meeting ended, David helped Mary clear away the chairs. They worked in silence until she spoke. You did well today, she said, folding the chair. Talking is hard, but you did it. I'm not sure it helped, he replied, placing the chair against the wall. It helped, Mary smiled. You just haven't seen it yet. David Clark stood in Mary Thompson's dusty front yard, staring at her old Ford Taurus, which refused to start. It was April 2020, and the warm Texas sun was hot, forcing him to wipe the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his t-shirt. Mary, who runs a support group for veterans, had called him that morning, almost apologetically, asking for help with the car. David agreed, although he was surprised by his decision. He was used to keeping to himself, especially after his divorce from Linda and everything that had followed. Are you sure it's not too much trouble? Mary asked, standing next to the open hood. She was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, with her hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her eyes were warm as always, but with a hint of worry. A hassle? David chuckled, rummaging around in the engine. This isn't a tank. The starter is probably dead. Give me half an hour. Half an hour? Mary raised an eyebrow. You're bragging, Clark. I'm not bragging, he said, hiding a smile. I just know what I'm doing. Mary laughed and went into the house, promising to bring lemonade. David got his tools out of his truck, feeling strangely calm. He wasn't used to days like this, no flights, no whiskey, no heaviness of thoughts about Linda. It had been 6 months since he'd learned of her infidelities and the rumors that she'd gotten involved with shady people, maybe even been an escort. The pain was still there, but in the support group he attended each week, he'd begun to find something new, not answers, but breathing. He removed the starter, checked the wires, and found the brushes were worn out. A simple problem that he could fix in an hour if he had the parts on hand. David sat up, wiping his hands on a rag, when Mary returned with 2 glasses of lemonade. Here, she said, holding one out. You deserve it. I'm not finished yet, he replied, but he took the glass. The lemonade was cold, slightly sour, and David drank half of it in one gulp. I see you weren't kidding about the half hour. Mary nodded at the engine. Where did you learn to fix cars? In the army, he said, putting his glass on the hood. Then on trips. When the truck breaks down in the wilderness, you learn quickly. A useful skill, she smiled. My husband was like that too. He could fix anything from a toaster to a motorcycle. David nodded, remembering that Mary had lost her husband in Afghanistan. She had spoken about it in the group, but without tears, with a quiet strength that made him respect her. He didn't know how she coped, but her presence, calm, unobtrusive, made his own pain a little easier. I need to go get some parts, he said, closing the hood. There's a car shop in town. Want to come with me? Aren't you going to run away with my lemonade? Mary narrowed her eyes, playfully wagging her finger. No chance, he replied, and they both laughed. They got into his truck, and David drove down the narrow road into town. The radio was playing an old Bob Seger song, and Mary was singing along, slightly out of tune. David glanced at her and found himself smiling. It was strange to be laughing, to be talking about nothing, to feel normal. After Linda, he had avoided people, afraid to trust again, to be betrayed again. But Mary was easy, as if she expected nothing from him except that he be himself. At the auto shop, David quickly found the necessary starter brushes, and Mary bought a couple of light bulbs for the house, declaring that he was now her official jack of all trades. Don't overdo it, he said, paying. I fixed one car, and you're already signing me up as a repairman. What? She shrugged, smiling. You have talent. I can pay you with lemonade. It couldn't be cheaper, he chuckled, and they laughed again. Back at her house, David worked on the starter while Mary sat on the porch, leafing through a magazine. She kept throwing out jokes, and he responded without looking up from his work. By midday, the car started at the first turn of the key, and Mary clapped her hands like a child. You're a genius, she said, getting out of the car. Seriously, David, thank you. You're welcome, he replied, wiping his hands. Glad to help. Then stay for dinner, she suggested. I've got chicken and potatoes. Nothing special, but you won't go away hungry. David hesitated. Part of him wanted to agree his day with Mary had been the best he'd had in a long time. But another part of him, the one still smarting from Linda's betrayal, whispered that getting too close was dangerous. He remembered their last conversation, her cold voice. We have nothing to talk about, David, Linda said then. It's over. Is it over? He almost shouted. You've been lying to me for years. Why? I have to go, she replied and hung up. Mary, noticing his hesitation, added, No strings attached, Clark. Just food. Won't make you sing karaoke. Karaoke? He laughed, and the tension went away. Okay, you talked me into it. Lunch was simple. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can. They ate at a small table in her kitchen, which smelled of spices and coffee. Mary told them about her life growing up in Oklahoma, meeting her husband, starting the group after he died. David listened, occasionally asking questions, and found himself talking about himself, about flights, about his home, even about Linda, albeit briefly. Do you miss her? Mary asked as they finished their coffee. Yes, he admitted, looking into his mug. But not the one that left, the one that was before Iraq. I understand, Mary nodded. I miss the Tom he was before the war. But we can't bring back the past. We can only live with what we have. Her words were simple, but they hurt him. He thought of Linda, her infidelities, the rumors that she had stooped to being an escort. He was still angry, but after talking to the group, especially Mary, he had begun to see her differently, as someone who could be broken by war, just as it had him. It didn't take away the pain, but it made it a little easier. They spent the rest of the day on the porch, talking about small things, cars, music, the time Mary had gotten stuck in the mud in that same Taurus. David laughed, the first real joy he had felt in years. But as the sun began to set, he felt a familiar fear. Mary was kind, open, but he was afraid to get close. Linda had taught him that trust could be shattered. I have to go, he said, standing up. Thank you for lunch. Thank you, Mary replied, looking at him. Come to the group on Tuesday, and, if anything happens, my Taurus can always break down again. David laughed, but her words stayed with him. He got into the truck, started the engine, and drove home. The road was dark, but for the first time in a long time, he felt warmth, not love, not hope, but a simple friendship that reminded him he was still alive. And though the fear of new connections remained, he knew he would return to Mary, to the group, to himself. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.